Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with counter offers and contract forms. So it has been brought to my attention that there is a little bit of confusion on this, so I want to clarify any and all confusion. So let's just say, for example, that a buyer writes an offer on the RE forms purchase and sale agreement. And we know from the previous video that the RE form purchase and sale agreement includes the standard terms. Whether or not they are attached, all of those terms and all of the promises between the buyer and the seller and the time frames and consequences for not meeting those promises are included in the standard terms. Again, I implore you to print out the standard terms, reference them, and attach them to the purchase and sale agreement. Nevertheless, they are part of the contract. So if a buyer makes an offer on the RE forms purchase and sale agreement and it goes over to the seller and the listing agent, what happens when the listing agent makes a counter offer on a different form? So let's say the listing agent makes a counter offer, and what the form they use and what they counter is they use the GAR form, Georgia Association of Realtors form, and they use the actual counter offer form, F22, counter offer or modification of an unaccepted original offer. So, and the seller fills this out, and basically they counter some of the terms. For example, purchase price, closing cost, closing date, days for due diligence, whatever it is that the seller chooses to counter. And it goes back to the buyer, and the buyer signs, agrees to those terms, signs the contract. We now have an accepted contract. And then the buyer sends the notice of the accepted contract back to the seller, and then we have a binding contract. So that is now binding upon the parties. So what terms are actually binding upon the parties? Well, if the original offer was written on the RE forms, purchase and sale agreement and standard terms, and the seller, all the seller used was the GAR counteroffer form, then the whole binding contract consists of everything from the original offer written on the RE forms plus whatever those specific items were that were countered. So that means all the pre-printed verbiage on the RE forms is still part of the binding agreement between the parties. And in the actual counteroffer form itself, it states, paragraph A, all previous counteroffers are rejected. B, this is the important part, relationship between original offer and this counteroffer. The original offer is hereby incorporated by reference into this counteroffer. However, the terms of this counteroffer shall modify and control over any conflicting or inconsistent provisions contained in the original offer. So whatever it is that you write as a counteroffer, again, in this example, I'm giving sale price, closing costs, so forth and so on. Everything else from the original offer is still intact. And then also in the GAR form, paragraph C, it does go on to state that when the counteroffer is signed by buyer and seller and a copy of the same is delivered to both parties, a legally binding contract agreement shall be formed. Since the original offer, including all exhibits thereto, is incorporated by reference into this counteroffer, only this counteroffer needs to be signed to create a legally binding agreement between the parties. Same thing happens if it's vice versa. Let's say the buyer writes a contract, writes an offer on a GAR purchase and sale agreement. The seller uses the RE forms counteroffer form to make the counteroffer, and that is RE form 110 counteroffer. And it does, again, state counteroffer made between the parties, the date, and then you write in what the seller, in this example, is countering. Purchase price is changed to, earnest money is changed to, closing costs are changed to, so forth and so on. Then there's a place to spell out any of the other terms that the party is countering from the original offer. Then this form states the original offer executed by the party making said offer as amended only by this final counteroffer executed by all parties shall constitute the full and entire agreement. Other counteroffers are not part of this contract. So what does this mean? What this means is you as agents, and again, in my example, we just went one go round, but it could be a counteroffer from a seller to a buyer or from a buyer to a seller or so forth and so on. What this means is as agents, you need to know what is contained in the pre-printed verbiage, the form itself of the GAR purchase and sale agreement, and whatever exhibits would be attached, as well as in the RE form purchase and sale agreement, plus the standard terms, plus any exhibits attached. So let me give you an example. An example was that happened is the buyer wrote an offer on an RE forms contract, purchase and sale agreement with the standard terms. The seller made a counter offer only using the GAR counter offer form. Went back to the buyer signed it, went back to the seller, went binding. And all they countered was, I believe, sale price and closing costs. Then everything went along great, and then the lender had some issues and could not get the loan closed based on the contracted closing date. Well, what happened was the seller wanted to stay in contract with the buyer. So the seller sent over a notice to unilaterally extend the contract based on the lenders not being able to get the loan closed due to no fault of the buyer, because the seller wanted to stay in contract with the buyer. Well, guess what? You can't use that. A unilateral notice to extend a contract is only a provision of a GAR purchase and sale agreement, not the RE forms. And the listing agent stated, yes, but I used the GAR counteroffer form. Yes, the seller used the GAR counteroffer form, but they didn't counter any of the other terms of the purchase and sale agreement, just the sale price and the closing costs. So the provision for a unilateral right to extend wasn't in the original offer of the RE forms contract. It was not an issue that was countered. So that's what I mean. You as agents, you guys need to know both sets of purchase and sale agreements, as well as the exhibit, standard terms, so forth and so on, so that you can explain everything to your party, your client, and make sure that they are using the contract form that is most appropriate for their real estate needs. Now, had the seller wanted to incorporate all of the terms of the GAR purchase and sale agreement in this example, for example, the unilateral right to extend, then rather than making a counteroffer just on this form and only countering sale price and closing costs, the seller would have had to have made a counteroffer on the entire GAR purchase and sale agreement. Then if it had gone back to the buyer and the buyer had signed it, agreeing to the terms and then sending it back to the seller to be binding, then all of the terms within the body of that purchase and sale agreement would have been binding upon the parties. For example, in this situation, unilateral right to extend the closing based on those specific terms. So again, bottom line is just using one of these two counteroffer forms, all that gets countered is just whatever the buyers and sellers agree to on these forms. And then the rest of the body of the original offer still is intact. Not only the fill in the blank parts, but the entire terms of the purchase and sale agreements and everything else that is attached that comes over from the original offer based on what contract package the buyer and seller, or in this case it would be a buyer because the offer would be originated by the buyer, is, and that's what would constitute the entire binding agreement, binding terms upon the parties. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.